thank you for coming. My name is Dale Hardiman. I went to Bendigo Senior. I was born and raised in Bendigo, and I moved to Melbourne when I was 18. I guess the most important thing to know about my work at Bendigo Senior was that I did terribly at school. So my enter score, my ATAR score was 53 when I finished year 12, which kind of didn't leave much room for me wanting to study afterwards. Yeah, so when I finished Bendigo Senior year 12, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but all the classes I'd done at Bendigo Senior were all studio arts, visual communication and design. But when I finished my year 12, I realized that all the courses I wanted to apply for had high enter scores, like ATAR scores of 85 plus. So I looked at Deakin for graphic design, VCA for fine art and sculpture, and I couldn't get into any of the classes just because it was so low. And it wasn't that I was lacking intelligence, I just didn't really care for school at the time. Like I had other interests which weren't going to school. So I was just flipping through the VCAT guide one day and came across furniture design. And the only reason why I really took any interest in furniture design in general, because I hadn't done any courses in furniture making or anything else throughout Bendigo Senior or high school, was the fact that it didn't need an ATAR score to enter. It was just folio based. And so I thought, well, furniture is kind of the closest thing to sculpture I can think of that I can get into without needing an ATAR score. So I started to think about furniture through the lens of sculpture rather than just making chairs for people to sit on like you're sitting on today. And so to afford to be able to move to Melbourne, because the course was at RMIT in Melbourne, I worked full-time for a year at Mullane Orchid on View Street. This is like 15 years ago. I worked for a year there to save money to move to Melbourne. And then I moved into a very terrible share house in Melbourne for a couple of years and studied furniture design. But what furniture design was, the associate degree of furniture design at RMIT, throughout that gap year I took to work to save money, I just developed a few things of furniture out of interest that I had. Rather than looking at the history of furniture, I just made some pieces, and like fairly sculptural pieces. Then I got into the course, which was great. From the associate degree in design in furniture, I could then move into industrial design. So I did my honours in industrial design at RMIT, and I could only do that because I'd done the associate degree in design prior. So I spent 4 years at RMIT studying furniture and industrial design. And over that time, I kind of gained an interest in furniture in general. But I guess the most important thing that I'd like you to take away from what I talk about today is that design is incredibly diverse. When you study one thing, it doesn't mean you end up doing that thing. And really, the most important thing I learned across those 4 years was really just about the design principles and elements. So the way to apply design in the broader world and what design can do. These are the three things that I do. So I run 3 different entities simultaneously because I have broad interests within design. So not just within making chairs. I'm also interested in the idea of a chair. So I run a company called Dow Jones. We reached 10 years last year. We reached our 10-year anniversary. So we have factories based in Geelong. We have a number of staff who are furniture makers. And our company was set up 10 years ago under the premise of making Australian manufacturing in Australia. So a lot of companies now import furniture from overseas, and we see that that has a huge environmental impact. And so we have upskilled and built factories out now based in Geelong which build furniture in Australia. Contemporary design, we build out furniture in Australia for large-scale projects through to cafes all around across Australia, and we also manufacture in America. But I also produce work under my own name, so I split across 3. The work I produce under my own name is more interested in the environmental implications and material qualities of the world around us, so the idea of mining underground, mining above ground, and then I explore topics that are more interesting to me, which means that they mostly result in gallery exhibitions. So the platform for the presentation of those works are generally contemporary art galleries, because they're the most appropriate way to talk about the work rather than the chair to be sat on directly. And then I also have a great interest in helping other people, so running projects which is about supporting a broader design community. And so I also run another project called Friends and Associates. So this year I'm running 3 exhibitions for Melbourne Design Week, and that'll be my 18th exhibition in the past 10 years I've organised as part of Melbourne Design, more broadly. But I'll go through specific projects so it makes a little more sense. You probably don't know what I do, and this probably makes very little sense. In my first year of university in furniture design, we were asked to make a wine stand, like a thing to hold wine, and it had to be made from a composite material. So my greatest strength I see is lateral thinking. Most of my peers in my class were quite literal thinkers, and so they said you must make a wine stand from a composite material, so a complex material, something like resin. You're probably aware of things like epoxy resin. So of the 18 people in my class, 17 used epoxy resin. I was living in a tiny share house in Carlton on Rathdown Street, and the idea, most of the students I was sharing the class with, they all still lived at home, and I was one of the only people living out of home. Because I lived in such a tiny house, and because epoxy resin is so toxic to work with, I thought, there's no way I'm going to work with this material in my house. And so I came across a wheat-based plastic. I could buy basically ingredients from the chemist and from the supermarket to make my own homemade plastic. This is a long time ago, so you can imagine plastics have developed a lot more in bioplastics, but this was very rudimentary. So I ended up converting that product into a thing called kids' straw stool. So it's made from a bunch of materials and chemicals which are based on tapioca starch. And then when you make a plastic from tapioca starch, it doesn't have very much strength, so I added pea straw to add strength. A little, like, if you understand what fiberglass does, it mats, tiny strands of glass mats. So this is what I did with the pea straw. And then I impregnated it with flower seeds. The idea was kids' furniture, as you probably are aware, is made from plastic, and it's usually low-cost plastic, which means that it's not very recyclable, and it also lasts for thousands of years. So imagine a child only needs kids' furniture for 4 years, maybe. What it's actually made from will last for thousands of years in landfill if it isn't reused. And so the idea of this project was to make a stool that you cooked at home, so you could buy the ingredients. And as part of my honours thesis, I actually wrote a cookbook for furniture. You could go to the supermarket, buy the ingredients, you could cook the stool at home, you cook it in the oven at 180 degrees for 2 hours, and then you sew it together with cotton thread. And at the end of its life, once the kid has finished using the stool, you can then put it in the garden, and after about 4 weeks, it breaks down in the natural environment to nothing, and then you can grow whatever seeds you like from the plant. So really, really lateral thinking towards the idea of kids' furniture and then composite materials as well. And this was when I was 21 years old. 19 years old, I worked on this project, which kind of expanded my idea of what furniture could really be outside of just making a thing that is static and doesn't have to speak to the broader world. This was a project called, I do a lot of work now with the National Gallery of Victoria. This is a project I did collectively with the National Gallery of Victoria a number of years ago. Every year or every 2 years, they run an event called the Best of the Best, which is an event run by the NGV's Women's Association. It's where they raise funds to either buy works or to support the broader NGV's mission. And they invite people to come in and make a table setting for a really grand invite-only dinner. And I was invited to design and create the NGV's table. So there's all these other businesses around. I was asked to do the NGV's table. And so the one thing I thought of is that this table only has to exist for 1 day. So if you think about plastics, steelwork, timberwork, these materials are meant to last for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But this dining table only has to last for 1 single night. So I did some research and came across a material called polycaprolactone. So this is a biodegradable, non-toxic plastic, and it melts at a kind of room temperature, at a boiling point. So all of the chairs and the table setting, all the plates, all the wine glasses and everything were made from this one polycaprolactone material, which meant that it only needed to last for that single night, and then I could actually remelt the material back down and use it. So a lot of the chairs were bought by the NGV for the permanent collection and then bought off to other private collections. But then half of this table was donated to someone, but then the other half of the table, I then worked with a foundation in Sydney to turn it into a dog kennel, which was then auctioned off to raise funds. But it just meant that, you know, furniture didn't need to be static, it didn't need to be a singular thing, and it could turn into something post-life of the actual work and creation. This is probably one of my most favorite projects because it was the most literal to get to. I was working on an exhibition for, if anyone has any questions at any point, also just ask if you like, otherwise it's just me talking for an hour. This is a project I worked on 4 or 5 years ago. I was with a friend who was having we used to have an office in Richmond. I was with a friend who was having the LCD panel replaced on his iPhone. Because, you know, when they scratch or they dent, you can actually go take them back and they'll replace the panel, not just the cover, but the actual panel itself. And we were surprised when they took that panel and they threw the panel into the bin. So we started doing some research and found that 98%, the statistics were showing 98% of iPhone LCD panels were being recycled in Australia. But as we went to more of these phone recycle shops, we realized they were just throwing them in the bin, and that actually wasn't being captured in the data. And so we started asking the phone recycle places if we could buy them, and they started saying, well, actually, no, it's $20. So they were trying to make money off the idea of this waste. And then we found a factory in Melbourne which just had surplus of these screens. So this is an LCD panel from an iPhone 8. We chose the iPhone 8 because it was the last iPhone that Apple actually publicly reported how many phones were sold. So we had the data to show how many phones there actually were in creation over that period of time. And then because we had access to all these LCD panels, we had access to all these little panels. So working with some electrical engineers from RMIT, who spoke Cantonese, we bought the iPhone 8 plans on the Chinese black market for $150 US, so it wasn't particularly legal. But it meant that we had the wiring system to be able to rewire these LCD panels. So what we did is we produced an exhibition, which was a series of 6 works, which looked at the reuse of these LCD panels. So this work on the left-hand side here, this was a light, but it was hooked up to an Arduino, so it imitated clouds passing by. And then this was kind of the key work from the exhibition. So this is called Digital Mirror. The work is called Open Garden because the way that phones and cars are made now is called walled garden. It's a system in which technology companies, they close systems down so you can't repair them and you're not allowed access to them. So we like the idea that we were now hacking and repairing this technology. So this is called a digital mirror. So this is 32 LCD panels from iPhone 8s, which have been hooked up to an Arduino, and there's a single camera in the middle. And the idea was when you look at the work, you're looking at yourself in 32 broken screens. You know, that is the Black Mirror effect. You are looking at yourself in the waste that is created by human beings. And the most interesting thing really was that it was in one of NGV's biggest shows a few years ago called the Triennial. And I went there a couple of times to have a look to see how the work was perceived by the audience. And more often than not, people just went and took selfies in this reflection of themselves, which was actually kind of half the point of what they were doing, which is they are using their own iPhone to take a photo of themselves in their own iPhone waste. This is kind of moving on to the kind of commercial work that I do. So we realized when Adam and I finished industrial design, so my business partner's named Adam in Dow Jones. When we graduated from RMIT, this was 12 years ago, we realized that there weren't many jobs in design. I mean, a lot has happened in the past 12 years. There's now a lot of small businesses, and it really is thanks to things like social media, because before social media, companies like ours, for us to be able to reach any audience, we'd either have to go to a trade fair, or we'd have to put an ad in a magazine, which would be tens of thousands of dollars. Whereas now, we can post something. We have like 111,000 followers on Instagram. We can post something and reach, like, I think our most viewed video is like 2.5 million people, just with a video we've made very quickly. So we graduated university and realized there were actually no real jobs in the occupation we wanted to do. And because our rents were really low at the time and we were really naive, we decided to start our own company. So I've actually never worked for someone else other than myself since graduating from RMIT. But the first thing we did was to rethink the way that furniture was presented, which is where the two of us kind of work together. We don't really, like the design language in the way that we produce our furniture isn't indicative of us, it's indicative of Australian manufacturing. So we don't sit down with a white piece of paper when we're designing and draw a chair and think it'd be great to make this chair. Instead, we work in partnership with factories. So we go to a factory and say, what can you do? This is the kind of price point, or this is what we'd like to do. How do we do it? And they work with us. So we think of our manufacturing, the manufacturers we partner with as our collaborators rather than just a company you send things to, which is more so what's happening now, which is people design things, they send it to a factory, and it just gets made. It's really inefficient, so we like this as an efficient way of manufacturing to keep things made locally. We also do special projects quite often. This is a project called Vanina Arca. Prior to 2020, we used to exhibit in Milan each year, and we did show at the Milan Furniture Fair for 5 years in a row. And we liked sending a single solitary object to Milan for an exhibition. So this project's called Vanina Arca. This is tattooed leather. The idea of the exhibition was, for us, about what has the most longevity in terms of craft. So when you think of craft now, you think most of it has now been overtaken by essentially robots. So you can now CNC timber. You don't need to make it by hand. Steel work can be done by robots as well. Most things within craft have been automated by different systems or by different robots. But the one thing that hasn't really been automated is tattooing as a craft. So the idea of creating a legacy object was our intention. So we worked with 3 tattoo artists who worked out how to tattoo onto leather. Leather's much different to tattoo than skin because skin has blood in it, which allows the ink to take up into the skin, whereas leather has no blood running through it because it's dead, which means it's really hard to keep the ink within the object. So what we actually had tattooed onto this cabinet was 12 Australian native botanicals. We had this exhibition in Europe, so we decided to send back 12 deadly toxic native plants to Europe. And so each one of the plants that was tattooed onto this cabinet is deadly toxic and is a native to Australia. We also think, when we're thinking about design, we also think about the way in which design is exhibited. So it's not just about the creation of the object, it's also about the way it's perceived and the way people will see it within a space. We did a show in New York a couple of years ago, which was launching this chair called the Sister Lounge. And look, when you do international fairs, we've done shows in Singapore, New York, Italy, Thailand. When you do these shows, you actually start to see the broader impact of waste that is created by exhibitions. The first time we showed in Singapore was when we were about 23 or 24 years old. You'd see a convention center which is, let's say 40 times the size of this, and it's all built up with MDF and plaster, and it's all painted. And as soon as 5 o'clock comes, and it's the end of the International Trade Fair, 100 people just come in with hammers and smash it all and put it in skips. And you just see how kind of environmentally toxic this whole industry is. And so we had this show organized for New York, and we started to think about how do you have the biggest show in New York in the smallest space with the smallest impact? Environmental impact, not broader impact. So we came up with this idea called Lobby. This is 2018. So the idea was we worked with this shop called Coming Soon in New York on the Lower East Side. It's quite a popular shop in the area. And we took over their basement, which was this small basement space. It was called Lobby because the idea was it was a space between the physical and the virtual reality. This is 2018, so this is pretty new for virtual reality. We found it very hard to get virtual reality headsets at that time, to rent them even in New York. So you walk down this staircase to the basement here. It was a really, really dark space with this neon sign lighting the space. We had smoky jazz playing, so it was sensorial. We had candles lit, and then you sat down on the chair and you put the VR headset on. You couldn't really see the chair, but once you looked down with the VR headset on, you could see you were sitting on the chair. And then we had a VR artist build out these ginormous rooms, which were designed around the way in which we work. So we had the smallest but largest show in New York, and we only had to send 2 chairs from Australia to New York to do the show. This is also, this is the kind of commercial work we do. So over the years, we've realized we aren't the best designers. That's one thing we can be quite certain of. We aren't the best designers. So we often collaborate with other designers to design for us. And so in 2020, we started running a competition called Design from Home, which was really about engaging people and community in kind of a company. So one of the things we talk about when it comes to our company is not just the physical durability of an object, not the aesthetic durability of the object, the emotional durability. How can you extend the life of an object that is beyond the actual commercial value, like the actual value of it financially, extend it into the emotional realm? And so a lot of this is done through engagement with groups and partnerships, but this is called the Big Friendly Couch, which is made in Melbourne. And we ran a competition called Design from Home, which is where anyone in Australia can enter the competition. They don't have to be a designer, they just have to be over 18 years old. And they can win $1,000, and the runner-up is $500. But you also get your chance to put your design into production. And so this was the runner-up of 2020. And to this day, we still make this design. We're about to do a project with Google in Melbourne with this lounge. And we pay royalties to our designer. Every time it sells, every quarter, we then pay a percentage of that to the designer. So essentially, these designers will now get paid forever until we stop producing them. This was an exhibition we did with the Geelong Gallery in 2021. Does anyone have any questions at this point, by the way? Or would you like me to just keep talking? I'll just keep talking. This was an exhibition we did in Geelong Gallery 2021 or 2022, I think. So we think a lot about locality and materials. So materials come from places, materials have histories. I guess the most interesting thing to say is, you probably don't see design a lot of the time around you. So this chair, for instance, you're sitting on, this is centuries of advancement in the technology and efficiency in manufacturing to make the thing that you sit on, which is you don't really notice at all. So we like to think, this chair was most definitely made in China, not made in Australia. It's made from injection molded plastic with a webbing seat. I don't know what the lifespan of the object is, and I don't know what the recycling of the material is, but when we think about design, we think of it as small as possible and as local as possible. So we started working with the Geelong Weaving Mill. So the Geelong Weaving Mill, Geelong has one of the longest histories of wool production in Australia. So about a century ago, there were over 200 mills in Australia which made both wool for upholstery, but also woolen blankets. Your parents probably have one of these old tartan blankets around their house. They were both made in Australia and New Zealand. And the Geelong Weaving Mill was one of the last 2 mills in Australia still making this traditional style. So we partnered with the Geelong Gallery to produce a series of chairs looking at the nostalgia of this material. And so we produced an exhibition of 8 chairs exploring wool production in the region, which was based around Geelong. As part of what we do in commercial design, we also partner with international designers. So this was a collaboration with an Argentinian studio called Riaz Studio. The purpose of that is that, I mean, we're always trying to think laterally about our approach to design. We always say we are business people, but first and foremost we're designers, so we're always thinking about design, and then business is the second component to what we do. So we met when we were in New York that one time. We met this studio called Riaz, and they're essentially the same as us, but in Buenos Aires. So they do everything the same things that we do about locality and materials, but they do it in Buenos Aires. So we decided to see if we could have kind of cross-exchange. So instead of importing their furniture to Australia, we decided to get them to design for us. So instead we could manufacture the Argentinian furniture in Australia as opposed to bringing it, and then we designed collections for them. So instead of shipping from Australia to Argentina, they manufacture Australian design in Argentina. And I guess most companies just don't think this way. They look at the profit margin and think it's much cheaper just to bring in things from overseas, whereas I guess we are trying to always use design thinking in the way in which we work in our business. This was a bench we produced for an exhibition in Italy a number of years ago. It's called Never Grow Up. The idea was when you're younger, like younger than you might carve something into a tree, you might write a friend's name or something in texta underneath a table, you might stick chewing gum under a table. But as you kind of get a little older, you stop doing those things. And so our idea was to create a platform that allowed that kind of, the allowance for that kind of creativity, but on a single object. So we designed a bunch of, this is a bench design we designed for some churches in Adelaide. We sent this one bench in just straight pink. We sent it to Milan, and then over 11 days, we had anyone and everyone who wanted to sign it with anything they liked all over the bench. And so we had thousands of people over 11 days sign that bench, and then we brought it back to Australia. And the idea was we weren't just creating design ourselves, we were creating the allowance of design to happen and creativity, and then we were able to bring it back to Australia. I guess the funny story about the bench is that the NGV acquired it for their permanent collection, and so when work goes into permanent collections, it's really about the maintenance, because these things now, for us it was really about this incidental office workers texture on top of this 2-pack paint. But the collections at NGV now needs to work out how to make this thing last for 1,000 years, because it has to go into storage, and they keep these collections indefinitely. And so I got a call one day from NGV Collections saying, what texture did you use? Because we need to maintain this thing for 1,000 years. And so I had to tell them what texture, and then they basically just said, we can never show it with UV light onto it, because the UV light will deteriorate the texture, and it has to be in temperature-controlled environment, which means that this funny little bench we sent over to Italy to get signed by a bunch of strangers now sits in this microclimatized cabinet that can never be shown in UV light because it will deteriorate the texture because it needs to last for 1,000 years, which is, I think, quite funny. We also do really funny things with the company. I guess design can be taken really seriously, and I think this is why we have succeeded over the past 10 years with our companies, because we not only think laterally, but a lot of design and architecture and interior design can be seen as being quite pretentious, and we don't really understand why it comes across as being quite pretentious. And so we do funny little objects throughout the year. Like this is a coffee table book that we made. I don't know if you know, there's a book called the Tom Ford Big Black Book. It's a big black book with Tom Ford written on the side. He's a really famous fashion designer. And interior designers tend to buy them to put them in their photo shoots to show that this is a beautiful interior because the Tom Ford book is in there. After I started talking to a few designers about that, I got a message from a friend in America who said that you could go on Amazon and just buy the cover for $5. So you don't actually need the book anymore. You can just buy the cover on Amazon for $5. So when you do the photo shoot, it still looks like you have the Tom Ford book, but there is no book. So we have a lot of timber waste in our timber factory in Geelong, so we created a thing called This Is Not a Coffee Table Book, This Is a Piece of Wood. And the idea was it was just a direct styling object in general made from scrap materials. We're about to reach our first edition completion. When we actually finish the project, to make a book registered, you have to get an ISBN, the little code that goes in the library. So we registered with an ISBN, so it has an ISBN you can scan at libraries. And then we sent one to the State Library of Victoria, because you need to send one to your library for it to be recognized as a real book. And one day I got a call from a librarian, from one of the head librarians at the State Library of Victoria saying, what have you sent me? And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, it looks like your book has gone through the system and no one's pulled it up as saying it's not a book, because it is published as a single-page book. And she said, you know what I'll do? I'll take it and I'll put it in the rare books collection, in the permanent collection, which means it's still categorized as a book, but you just can't take it out of the library. So now we have this ridiculous block of wood which now sits in the State Library of Victoria that you can go in and look at, but you need to wear white gloves, and you can only look at it during the day. Last year in July, we celebrated 10 years of our company, and as part of that, we were invited by the Geelong Wool Museum to do a 6-month-long anniversary exhibition. And so as part of that exhibition, we had 14 months to think about who we are and what we want to do and what we want to talk about within design. We thankfully had a lot of really good partners. So Laminex, which is a huge company who makes panel board, produced all the wall boards for us. Godfrey Hirst, one of Australia's biggest carpet company, gave us all the carpet for the bottom, for the flooring of the show. But the first thing we identified when we got into the gallery is that we didn't like the gallery. So sometimes, if you start working on a project, you go into the gallery, you don't like the gallery, what do? Well, we decided to build our own gallery inside the gallery. So we built an entire gallery space inside a gallery, so you couldn't actually see the original gallery itself. But I guess what we wanted to tell people about who we are is that we work with and we collaborate with the people around us. So within this exhibition, there was just over 2,000 other people named on didactics. So didactics being these boards on the wall. There was over 2,000 people throughout this exhibition named singularly on those didactics. And the idea was that design is not about the singular, about the silo. It's not about just the individual. It's about everyone engaged with design. So for instance, this is a pendant light we produced with a group called James Street Gallery. They're a gallery based in Geelong who work with adults with disabilities. So we took a pendant light that we make regularly, which is usually spun metal, and they replicated that in paper mache, and had 10 of their artists paint the pendants. And people really, really loved that. Like this dining table here was a collaboration with an Ethiopian-Norwegian artist. We produced this beautiful big blackwood table, and then we allowed Olana to paint the table in the way that he produces his work, which is very indicative of kind of graphic language in Ethiopia. And I guess the work that everyone who's seen the show mostly sees is this huge rug. So we made this rug, so this was the second version. If you remember, Never Grow Up was a bench that people got to sign onto and basically got to graffiti onto. We partnered with a group called the Museum of Play and Art. It's a museum in Geelong and now in Melbourne which works with children. And so for the month of January last year, anyone who went to the Museum of Play and Art who was under 13 or under 15 years old could draw a self-portrait. So we had just over 800 children over that month draw a self-portrait, and then this is sewn into fabric, which is a huge rug. The rug is 10 meters long, so it would be from where I'm standing to that wall long. That's how long it is, and about as high as this picture. It's a 10-meter long rug, which features 800 children from Geelong, which is a representation of the youth in Geelong. And we loved the idea of allowing children who'd come to the show, who'd generally come to a show and just see colour, they could actually see themselves in the exhibition. And more often than not, if we gave talks or public tours of the show, the kid would come up and see themselves, and they could see that they were inspired because they were in the show themselves. This is on, how am I doing for time?
It is 22.
Oh, good. So the third thing that I do, so I know that I'm talking a lot, it's a lot of information, but the third thing that I'm really interested in and have been for my entire career is the creation of work with others. So design and architecture and interior design can be very singular. It can be very much about what am I doing, how am I doing it, whereas when I first moved to Melbourne 12 years ago, there were really no design exhibitions. And it was just by chance that my partner's sister worked at a gallery on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, and every 2 weeks there was a new art exhibition. And in Melbourne, there's hundreds of art exhibitions every week you can go to, but there was only 2 design exhibitions a year, which didn't really make much sense to me because, design is everywhere as well. And so when I was 21, I organized my first design exhibition at this gallery on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, and I invited 20 designers to show their work within this space. And at the opening of that event, they sold more alcohol than they had in the history of that gallery, which is 30 years old, which showed to us that people were interested in design. And so ever since then, so now for the past 14 years, I've been organizing design exhibitions each year, which is really about instigating other people to think about what they do. This was an exhibition called Welcome to Wasteland, which is where we invited 22, I think it was, or 23 designers or architects. When you're a designer, you end up just kind of doing things. You're running a business primarily, so you're practicing, and especially architects. Architects don't really get a time to reflect on their impact a lot of the time, which meant that with this exhibition, we invited them to produce a series of works where they could made from waste. So how can you, as an architect, as a creative, use waste streams to create a work for the exhibition? I guess the 2 most interesting things we got to do with the exhibition was that we built a website that was entirely solar powered, which meant that, and we intentionally put a tiny battery on the website, which meant that if the sun wasn't up, the website would go down. It was just showing a direct link between energy and consumption, which meant that, it was a really cloudy day, the website was kind of up, so you could only really see the website when it was really sunny, but at nighttime the website was down because there was no sun. And then on the right-hand side here, you probably know in most galleries there is vinyl. Vinyl is primarily a plastic petroleum-based material, and it all goes into landfill. So we found this system called the EBS 260. It's essentially like a little handheld, it's like a little handheld scan printer. They use it in factories, they use it in like logging mills. It kind of, you digitize it, you put the language in, and then you just wipe it across, and it's like a handheld printer. It's like an inkjet printer, but in your hand, which meant that we could do the signage for this entire exhibition with a tiny little ink cartridge, which was far less than vinyl. And it gave the overall language of the exhibition. And there's just, you know, like this work here by Sarah Soravolo just here. This was HDPE polyethylene stainless steel. So the plastic from here was actually made from needles from a hospital local to her that she was able to obtain. Because if you think of all the plastic waste out of hospitals, there's a huge amount. Whereas she was able to capture some of that plastic and start producing new products from it. Well, these are 4 of the works that I really liked from the show, just to explain the different thinking. So this is a work made from golf balls. This is a guy in Adelaide who drills golf balls and produces furniture. This is a work by Ebony Heidenreich. So this is when you make ceramics, when you're in big studios in ceramics, they'll have a grate, and usually all the sludge, all the ceramic that comes off that will go down that drain, and that's just like a sludge. She would capture that sludge and she would refire it into these beautiful brick forms, into these lights, but it was just a complete runoff of waste. This is called lettuce eat. That's compressed lettuce, so dehydrated and compressed lettuce, which went into temporary plates. So, you know, we have paper and plastic plates. These were plates made from dehydrated and compressed plates, which you could eat off, and at the end of their life, they would decompose rapidly. And this is a work by German designer Bas Stitgen. That's compressed blood, which sounds really gross, but historically, that's a way that objects were made centuries ago, which was by compressing animal blood. And so although it's quite garish and it's not, it was really about experimentation and pushing people to look outside their regular practice, and that's what these forums are for. This was an exhibition that I did last year, so if you ever get a chance to come to Melbourne during Melbourne Design Week, please do, because it really is now the centre of design in Australia, mostly because it has the most funding, it has the most programming, it has the most activation of designers in the country in one place at once, which happens in May of each year. Melbourne Design Week is 8 years old, and I've done many, many shows for Melbourne Design Week, group exhibitions and solo, and I started to realize that early year practitioners were kind of being left out, because it's really hard to do an exhibition when you have, well, firstly, you don't have confidence, and you don't have money, and if you don't know people, and you have very, very low chance of being able to organize, because you have to organize everything yourself. You have to organize the venue, the work that's in it, the lighting, who's going to staff it. There's a lot going on. And so after doing all these really quite large shows, last year I did a show called 1 Hour Exhibition. So this is a warehouse space in Fitzroy. We took over for 1 hour. If you needed to turn up at midday, and at midday you had to bring something to sit on to exhibit. And so we had 86 people who turned up. And the one thing that was really important is that when you turned up, you had to sign your name at a time. So I turned up at 12:01, and you kept that card. To leave, you had to show the card. I mean, you could legally leave, but to really be a part of the exhibition, you had to sign your name and the time. So what people didn't realize, the point of the exhibition, it wasn't actually about the presentation of work. It was that we're able to lock people in a room for 60 minutes and force them to meet each other. So what people weren't aware of is that I'd contacted all the local universities, RMIT, Deakin, Monash, and told the lecturers to bring their students along. And I'd also contacted a lot of my friends who were quite well-known designers and told them, you have to be here. So we had both the most kind of established and famous designers in Australia, and we had all the students from the university locked in a room for 60 minutes. So just by chance, they had to meet. And so many people formed long-term relationships by being at this exhibition. And then part of the exhibition is that we documented everyone sitting. So this is a CD someone's sitting on. And then we did the photo shoot with the clock, so you could see at each time of the day what time the photo was taken. I think I'm coming to the end of this presentation, but last year I also did this show called Souvenir, which was really about design consumption. So design has changed in the past 10 years, and it's changed really, really rapidly. We now have a thing in Australia called collectible design, which we didn't 10 years ago. Collectible design is really about the creation of one-off and experimental objects, but more often than not, high expensive values. So we're thinking $10,000 for a chair, $50,000 for a cabinet. A friend of mine sells credenzas upwards of $250,000 per object. And so design is moving up really, really rapidly in that really expensive route. And so I decided last year to partner with a bookstore in Collingwood called Euro Publications and to do a show called Souvenir, which is where I asked really, really well-known designers around Australia to make an object that had to be sold for under $120. So instead of it continuing to grow and getting more and more expensive and more collectible, I decided to ask these designers to try to think about what they do and then create a souvenir of their practice. Like the way we thought about it is, if you know those little souvenir teaspoons from the past, like our nanas might have them, you know, it's like a little teaspoon which has a little place in the enamel on it of where it's been. That's exactly what it was. So this is a work by Damien Wright. Damien Wright's one of Australia's most famous furniture makers. He works with the oldest timber in the world, so 20,000 plus years old is the timber he works with. It's called ancient red gum. So this is a doorstop for $120 made from the oldest timber in the world. And it meant that people were able to actually own these artifacts within their homes, and design and collectible design wasn't just for the ultra-rich. That's actually the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've just been talking about? Hello. Within just all of the things, like it's really. I think it depends on the way you design. So a lot of companies who design primarily for profit, which is that they design an object just to make money, they will come into a lot of issues because they are just trying to make a thing to sell, and whatever's popular at the time has probably been done before. Working the way that we kind of work, which is in partnerships with manufacturers or thinking about social or environmental issues, don't really ever run into that issue because what you're exploring is new territory. But I mean, the good thing about Google is image reverse search. So a lot of the times when we're designing for our commercial company, because we'll sell thousands of these things over the years, it is good to find out if that thing has happened before. Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi there. The work you created that was just in the exhibition in Geelong just recently, the William Mills, were you selling the pieces as well, or were they just created for display for that exhibition?
Thankfully, the Geelong City Council funded the exhibition, which was really good. I mean, that was a very awkward thing because you make work for a museum show, but you can't tell anyone it needs to be sold after the show. And so we made the works for the exhibition for the intention of that 6-month period. And then we thankfully were able to talk to a few people about buying. So the NGV took a work. Geelong Gallery is getting back to us about one of those particular works. But I mean, a lot of the chairs sold, but the more experimental works, we're still unsure what to do with them. They're wrapped in our factory.
What advice would you give to someone who's interested in pursuing a career in design?
It really depends on what area of design they're interested in. But I mean, the one thing that probably built my entire career was that when I moved to Melbourne, I knew no one in Melbourne. Like, I'm from Bendigo, all my friends were in Bendigo. Only one of my friends moved from Bendigo to Melbourne with me, so I was just with my partner. Was that when I moved to Melbourne, I just contacted people that I liked their work. So I just found them online. I looked up Furniture Designers Melbourne, and I found a bunch of designers that I really liked their work, and then I contacted them and said, can I buy you a coffee? And I'm not like, I know I'm very chatty here, but I'm not exactly the most social, extroverted person. So I contacted a bunch of people. Every single one of them responded to me, and every single one of those people today is one of my close friends, in terms of being not just a peer colleague, but actually a friend as well. And that's because the design community, especially in Melbourne, I don't really know Bendigo so much in terms of design, but the Melbourne design community is very different to that of, let's say, Sydney or Queensland, in that they're very supportive. Like, even now, if you're interested in design, look up a designer and contact them. Like, more often than not, they will actually respond to you. Interior design practices, architecture practices, they will probably respond to you, and just ask them a bunch of questions about a career. So that was one of the most helpful things for me, was that I could realize there was a career in this, because I could just ask someone who was doing it. Any?
Sorry, just out of interest, did you learn a lot about the biodegradable plastics and more sort of sustainable materials through your university courses, or did you do a lot of that research independently?
All independently. This was, when I studied, was quite a number, 12 years ago or so. There wasn't particularly much about sustainability within university course framework. And so I just looked at it from a logical sense more than anything else at the time. But I got really interested in environmental materials back in the early days and just started reading a lot of books about the impact of the environment at that time, because I was studying a course called Industrial Design. We're talking about Industrial Revolution, about mass production and globalization. So I wanted to be aware of the impacts of that at the time. But the course wasn't framed. I mean, they are now a lot more, but no, not so much.
If you could
Most important influence? Actually, it's someone I went to Bendigo, one of my teachers at Bendigo. So Marg Standen was my teacher at Bendigo Senior. I named one of my first furniture pieces after her. So I went through Bendigo Senior through studio arts programs and visual communication. I wasn't very good. I mean, I applied myself to the arts programs, but I didn't apply myself to anything else, which meant my ATTA score was really low. Whereas Marg Standen actually lifted me up. And I think through her lifting me up, that really pushed me on to study further. And so I'd say my Bendigo Senior time with Marg Standen.
How long does it take for you to think up a design?
Usually it's not forced. Like when it comes to, so my group exhibitions, they're usually framed around a period of time, so we have to come up with an idea fairly rapidly. For my personal work, I only ever really make work once I have an idea, so I don't start approaching galleries without a premise or an idea or context to create within. For the commercial company, it's a little more rapid because we have to sell more. Like we have to create things that sell because that supplies our staff with incomes and factory rent and everything else. And so I guess we tend to work around processes primarily. Like we don't really start, I mean, it really depends. So some of the things we've designed, we've produced within 6 weeks from original idea to straight to market. 6 weeks is the quickest we've ever done. The longest is 2 years, from original idea all the way through to actually selling it. But I guess once you learn the language of design, you just start having lots of ideas and you just put them into notebooks. And then if you're thinking, oh, I need a new timber collection because this is what we're working on, you've just got all these different ideas.
How did you go about launching your business and its startup?
The thing that really helped us was that we launched our company at pretty much the same time Instagram became popular. And so we were just very lucky. There was a very early overlap of social media. But what social media enables now is that the visibility of anything, of any creation, of any work ever. Like if someone paints a painting, you can show it to 10 million people if you can get it there. I guess we were young enough in that we were 21 and 23 when we started the company that we didn't have other jobs. We just did this thing. And so we just started acting like it was our job. And we just started looking at exhibitions and trade fairs. So we started showing it in trade fairs in Melbourne and Sydney. We'd drive to Sydney to save money, drive the van up to Sydney. We just started showing it, and then after that, after a long enough time, people started to take interest in it and wanting to buy it. So really it takes a long time, but social media has made that time a lot shorter if you can do that well.